Asterisk, asterisk. Part 1. The Young Bride in the Wild West, asterisk, asterisk. The Wyoming wind had a voice of its own. It was not the gentle whisper of the eastern woods Evelyn Grace had left behind, but a raw, ceaseless moan that swept across the high plains, carrying the scent of dust, sage, and a profound, unnerving emptiness. For 3 days, the stagecoach had rattled her bones and filled her lungs with the grit of the trail, each mile drawing her further from the known world and deeper into the heart of a life she had only read about in stark, impersonal letters. At 18, Evelyn was a bride. Though she had yet to meet her husband, she was a paradox, bundled in a respectable gray traveling dress that was now powdered with a fine layer of ochre dust, a woman by law and societal decree. Yet a girl in every way that mattered. Her heart, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs, beat against the corset that was a relic of the life she was supposed to be leaving for a better one. Better, her father had said, his voice strained with the quiet desperation of a man with too many daughters and not enough prospects. Asterisk security. Asterisk. The matchmaker's letter had promised, the word written in a firm, confident hand. Asterisk. A fine man of means, a rancher of considerable property. The name, Jebediah Claymore, felt heavy and strange on her tongue, like a stone she was meant to swallow. She had a photograph, a stiff, formal portrait of a man with eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. He was not old, but he was not young. 35, the letter stated. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, a jaw set with a stubbornness that seemed carved from the very rock of the mountains rumored to loom in the distance. There was no smile, no hint of warmth. He was a silhouette of a man, and she was traveling thousands of miles to become his wife. The stagecoach crested a final rise, and the driver, a grizzled man named Silas, whose conversational offerings had been limited to grunts and spits of tobacco juice, finally spoke. "Cedar Creek," he announced, the words nearly stolen by the wind. Evelyn leaned out, her gloved hands gripping the window frame. It was less a town and more a wound in the vast, empty landscape. A single wide dirt street was flanked by a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors that seemed to gasp with every gust of wind, a blacksmith's forge sending dark plumes of smoke into the pale, endless sky, and a stark, white-steepled church that looked lonely and defiant. There were no trees to soften the harsh lines, no gardens to offer a splash of color. It was a place built for function, not for comfort, and the sight of it made the knot of fear in Evelyn's stomach tighten into a cold, hard fist. As the coach slowed, faces turned toward them. Men in dusty hats paused, their hands hovering over their work. Women in faded calico dresses stopped shaking out rugs on their porches, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and hard-bitten judgment. Evelyn felt their eyes on her like a physical weight. She was the new thing, the mail-order bride from the east, the girl coming to marry the hermit of Stone Creek Ranch. When the coach door opened, she hesitated, her courage failing her. Silas, with a surprising gentleness, offered a hand. "Best get on out. Miss, he'll be waiting." Standing on the dusty street, Evelyn felt small and terribly out of place. Her modest bonnet and neatly pinned hair seemed a foolish vanity in this raw, untamed world. And then she saw him. He was taller than the photograph suggested, broader in the shoulder. He stood apart from the small cluster of onlookers, his stance rooted and unyielding, as if he were a part of the land itself. He wore practical, sturdy denim trousers tucked into scuffed leather boots, and a plain, dark shirt. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the same hard lines of his face from the portrait, the same intense, unreadable eyes. Jebediah Claymore did not walk toward her. He waited. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Evelyn forced her feet to move. Each step felt a mile long. The silence of the street broken only by the creak of a sign and the ever-present cry of the wind. She stopped a respectable few feet from him, clutching her small valise. "Mr. Claymore," she asked, her voice thin and reedy. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more habit than courtesy. "Miss Grace." His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like unpolished granite. The journey was satisfactory. It was a businessman's question, not a groom's. It was long. "Sir." "This land is long," he replied, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her slight frame, her pale face, her city-soft hands. There was no welcome in his eyes, only a quiet, detached assessment. It was the look of a rancher inspecting new livestock. The thought came unbidden and sharp, and she felt a hot flush of shame and anger. Was this all she was, a transaction? "My things," she began, gesturing back at the coach where her trunk was being unloaded. "Silas will see it brought to the wagon," he said, turning without another word. He led the way to a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched to 2 powerful horses. He moved with a long, sure-footed stride, a man completely at home in his environment, which only served to heighten her own sense of displacement. He loaded her trunk with an economy of motion that spoke of immense physical strength, then turned and offered a hand to help her up to the seat. His grip was firm and calloused, his skin rough against her glove. The brief contact sent a shiver through her that was not entirely from the cold. The ride to his ranch was conducted in a taut, suffocating silence. Evelyn sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of rolling brown hills and gray-green sagebrush. She tried to think of something to say, a polite inquiry about his land or his cattle, but the words died in her throat. The man beside her was a fortress, his silence a wall she did not know how to breach. She risked a sideways glance at him. His profile was stark against the sky, his attention on the horses and the trail ahead. She wondered what he was thinking, what he saw when he looked at her. Did he feel any of the terror that was currently choking her, or was she merely the final piece of a plan, a necessary component for the life he had decided to build? They passed herds of cattle, long-horned and shaggy, that bore a brand she didn't recognize, a C intertwined with a rock. Claymore's cattle, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. The sheer scale of it was staggering. The letters had spoken of property, but this was a kingdom, a vast, lonely kingdom ruled by this silent, solitary man. Finally, after nearly an hour, they topped a ridge and she saw the ranch house below, nestled in a shallow creek valley that offered some protection from the wind. It was not a rustic cabin, but a large 2-story house built of thick, dark timber and solid river stone. It was a handsome, imposing structure, but like the town, it had a stark, unadorned quality. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. Surrounding it were several large barns, corrals, and outbuildings, all built with the same sturdy, practical design. Stone Creek Ranch. It sounded as hard and unforgiving as its owner. Jebediah brought the wagon to a halt in the yard and was on the ground before the wheels had fully stopped turning. "We'll be married in the morning," he stated, not looking at her. "The justice of the peace will ride out from town. You can rest today." The flat finality of his words took her breath away. There would be no courtship, no gentle words, not even the pretense of romance. It was an arrangement, stark and simple. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch as impersonal as before, and led her to the front door. The inside of the house was clean and orderly, but deeply masculine. The main room was vast, dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a low fire crackled. The furniture was heavy and dark, built for endurance, not elegance. There were shelves filled with ledgers and books on animal husbandry, but no paintings on the walls, no delicate knickknacks on the mantel, none of the small, soft touches that would have marked a woman's presence. A faint scent of wood smoke, leather, and coffee hung in the air. Your room is upstairs. First on the right, he said, pointing toward a broad wooden staircase. I'll bring your trunk. There's water in the pitcher if you wish to freshen up. Supper is at sundown. He turned and walked back outside, leaving her standing alone in the cavernous room. The silence rushed in to fill the space he had vacated, amplifying the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Evelyn felt a wave of dizziness, a desperate urge to run out the door, to chase down the stagecoach and beg Silas to take her back. But back to what a life of genteel poverty, of being a burden on her family, of withering into spinsterhood. Her father's face swam before her eyes, his expression a mixture of love and relief when he told her of Mr. Claymore's offer. Asterisk, he will provide for you. Evelyn, you will be safe. Was this safety? This cold, echoing house? This life yoked to a stranger whose eyes held no light, whose voice held no warmth? With leaden feet, she climbed the stairs. The room he had indicated was large and sparsely furnished with a sturdy bed frame, a washstand, and a large wardrobe. The bed was covered with a simple, heavy quilt. A single window looked out over the vast, empty plains, the sky above a canvas of deepening gray. It was a room for sleeping, not for living. A cell. Her trunk appeared at the door a few minutes later, carried effortlessly in Jebediah's arms. He set it down just inside the room, careful not to cross the threshold. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a curt nod, his eyes flicking around the room before settling on her face. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something different in his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps, or a shadow of a long-forgotten pain. Then it was gone, replaced by the same impenetrable mask. "Rest," he said, and then he was gone, his heavy bootfalls echoing down the stairs. Alone again. Evelyn walked to the window. The wind pressed against the glass, its mournful song a lament for the girl she had been. She had come to the West dreaming of a new beginning, of a home of her own, of a husband she could learn to love. She had imagined a partnership, a life built together against the hardships of this new frontier. But the reality was colder, harder than she could have ever conceived. She was not a partner. She was an acquisition, a housekeeper and a future mother for a man who seemed to have walled off his heart with the same stone he used to build his house. Tears she had held back for days finally pricked at her eyes. She would not cry. Not yet. Crying was a luxury for the life she had left behind. Here, in this wild, unforgiving land, tears were a weakness, and she had a feeling she would need all the strength she could find. She had made a bargain, and now she had to live with it. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Jebediah Claymore, and tonight, for the first time, she truly understood the terrifying meaning of being alone. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 2. At 18, she cried on wedding night. Asterisk, asterisk. The wedding was as spare and unadorned as the land itself. Justice of the Peace Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently chiseled into an expression of weary pragmatism, rode out from Cedar Creek. The ceremony took place in the main room of the ranch house, before the cold stone hearth. Jebediah's foreman, a quiet, sun-weathered man named Eli, and his wife, Martha, stood as witnesses. Martha, a kind-faced woman who had offered Evelyn a brief, sympathetic smile, had helped her dress in the simple cream-colored gown she had sewn for the occasion. Evelyn's own voice was a tremor in the vast, silent room as she spoke her vows. The words felt foreign, scripted for a play in which she was an unwilling actress. Jebediah's responses were low and firm, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of her girlhood. When the justice pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss. Jebediah simply gave a curt nod, his hand enclosing hers for a brief, formal shake. The touch of his calloused skin was dry and impersonal. A contract had been sealed. The Millers and the foreman's family did not stay for supper. The occasion did not call for celebration, and Jebediah Claymore was not a man who inspired lingering. as dusk bled across the plains, casting long, skeletal shadows from the corrals. Evelyn found herself seated opposite her husband at the long, dark dining table. The space between them felt as wide and empty as the Wyoming Territory itself. Martha had left a pot of hearty beef stew simmering on the stove and a loaf of fresh-baked bread on a cutting board. Jebediah served them both with an efficient, silent competence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against pottery, the ticking of the grandfather clock, and the ceaseless, lonely cry of the wind outside. Evelyn could not eat. The stew, which smelled rich and savory, turned to ash in her mouth. Every muscle in her body was coiled with a tension so profound it was a physical ache. She was acutely aware of him, of the sheer size of his presence across the table. He ate with a slow, deliberate purpose, his gaze fixed on his plate. He did not seem to notice her lack of appetite, or if he did not comment. When he finished, he rose and carried his own bowl to the dry sink. He did not take hers. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. He was not her servant, but neither did he seem to feel any husbandly obligation to tend to her. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and her presence was an intrusion he had not yet learned how to accommodate. He lit a lantern, the yellow light pushing back the encroaching darkness but creating deeper, more menacing shadows in the corners of the room. "It is late," he said. It was a statement, not an invitation. The dread that had been a low hum in her veins all day crescendoed into a roar. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner. She could not breathe. She rose from her chair, her legs feeling unsteady and weak, and followed him up the broad wooden staircase. He did not lead her to the guest room where she had spent the previous night. He led her to a door at the end of the hall, his own room. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, holding the lantern aloft. The room was larger than hers, dominated by a massive bed with a heavy, carved headboard that looked like a monument in the flickering light. Like the rest of the house, it was Spartan and deeply masculine. A rifle was propped in one corner. A pair of worn boots stood beside a plain wooden chest. The room smelled of him of soap, leather, and the clean, cold scent of the outdoors. He set the lantern on the nightstand beside the bed. "I will give you a moment," he said, his back to her. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He was granting her a reprieve, not out of kindness, but out of a sense of detached propriety. He walked out, closing the door softly behind him, and she heard his bootfalls retreat down the hall. Alone, Evelyn felt the walls closing in. The bed loomed before her, a stark white expanse of sheet in the lantern light. It was the altar upon which her innocence was to be sacrificed. Her hands trembled so violently she had to clasp them together to still them. In her trunk was the nightgown her mother had packed for her, a delicate thing of white cotton and lace that now seemed a cruel mockery. She moved as if in a trance, unlatching her trunk and pulling out the gown. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress, her movements clumsy and jerky. Undressed. The cool air of the room touched her skin, and she shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. She was so young, so unprepared. The whispers and vague warnings of the married women back home had been just that, whispers. They had not prepared her for the stark, terrifying reality of this moment. Alone in a strange house with a man she did not know, a man who now owned her by law. Was this all she was, a piece of property, purchased to warm a bed and, God willing, produce an heir the security her father had promised felt like a gilded cage? She stared at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror above the washstand. A pale, wide-eyed girl stared back, a stranger with fear-haunted eyes. This was Evelyn Grace Claymore. The name felt like a costume she was being forced to wear. She heard his footsteps in the hall again, heavy and certain, and a wave of pure panic washed over her. She pulled the nightgown on, the soft cotton a flimsy shield against what was to come. She sat on the edge of the immense bed, her spine rigid, her hands twisting the fabric of the gown in her lap. The door opened, Jebediah entered, and the room seemed to shrink. He had removed his gun belt and his outer shirt, leaving him in his plain under-Henley, which stretched across the broad expanse of his shoulders and chest. In the lantern light, he looked even bigger, more powerful. He closed the door, and the soft click of the latch sounded like a prison bolt sliding into place. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable in the shifting shadows. He was a man of the West, a man who had faced death in the war and carved a life out of a hostile wilderness. His needs were direct, his approach uncomplicated. A wife was a wife. A wedding night had a purpose. He moved toward the bed. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. She tried to be brave, to remember her duty. She was a wife. This was her responsibility. But her body betrayed her. A single, hot tear escaped from beneath her eyelid and traced a burning path down her cheek. She tried to swallow the sob rising in her throat, but it came out as a choked, desperate gasp. Another tear followed, and then another. She turned her head away, pressing her lips together to stifle the sound of her weeping, ashamed of her weakness but utterly powerless to stop it. At 18, she cried on her wedding night. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. Her silent, shuddering sobs seemed to fill the room, and then she felt the mattress shift as he had been about to sit, but he stopped. The motion was arrested. The air grew still, slowly, fearfully. She opened her tear-blurred eyes and dared to look at him. He was standing beside the bed, frozen, his large frame rigid. He was staring at her, but the look in his eyes was no longer one of simple, masculine purpose. It was something else, a deep, troubled confusion. He had fought men. He had tamed wild horses and stared down blizzards that could freeze a man solid in minutes. He had buried his father and brother with his own 2 hands. He understood violence and hardship and the cold calculus of survival. But this was a language he did not know. The silent, terrified weeping of a girl who was now his wife. His mind warred with itself. A raw, primal part of him, the part forged in the harshness of his life, felt a surge of frustration. A bargain had been struck. This was his right. It was the way of the world. He had paid a handsome fee to the matchmaker, provided a home, offered his name. He had fulfilled his part of the contract. But as he looked at her, huddled on the edge of his bed, looking so small and fragile, another part of him stirred, a part he had thought long dead and buried. He saw not the woman he had married, but a child, ripped from her home and planted in this hard, alien soil. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the sheen of tears on her pale cheeks, the raw terror in her eyes when she glanced at him. One of her tears fell from her chin, landing on the stark white of the bedsheet. It was a tiny, dark circle on the pristine cotton, a minuscule stain that seemed to hold all the weight of her lost youth and her profound despair. The sight of it lanced through him with an unexpected sharpness. It was not a mark of consummation, but a mark of sorrow. He thought of his own mother, her face a faded memory, but her absence a wound that had never truly healed. He thought of the brutality of his father, a man who took what he wanted without a thought for the pain it caused. He had sworn he would never be that man. The battle within him was brief but fierce. The hard man of the West, the hermit of Stone Creek Ranch, took a step back. The cow-cat that had been a low fire in his blood cooled to embers. Evelyn watched him through her tears, her breath catching in her throat, expecting roughness, a harsh command. Instead, he slowly raised a hand and ran it over his own face, a gesture of profound weariness. "There is no need for that," he said. His voice was rough, gravelly, as if the words were being dredged up from a deep, unused well. He turned away from her and walked over to the single armchair that sat near the cold hearth. He sank into it, the old wood groaning under his weight. He did not look at her again. He simply sat there, a large, silent silhouette in the dim light. staring into the empty fireplace as if he could see ghosts in the ashes. The silence that fell was different now. It was still thick with tension, but the immediate threat had receded. Evelyn's sobs slowly subsided into shuddering breaths. She watched him, wary and confused. He had stopped. He had seen her tears, and he had stopped. He had not offered comfort, no soft words or gentle touch, but he had given her something more precious, a reprieve. He had acknowledged her fear. Minutes stretched into an hour. The lantern flickered, its oil running low. Jebediah did not move from the chair. Evelyn remained on the edge of the bed, her muscles still tight, but the icy fist of panic in her chest had begun to loosen its grip. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he rose from the chair. He walked not to the bed, but to the large wardrobe. He pulled out a thick wool blanket, then retrieved a spare pillow from the top shelf. He walked to the far side of the room, away from the bed, and laid the blanket on the floor, arranging the pillow at its head. Without a word, he blew out the lantern, plunging the room into a deep darkness broken only by a sliver of pale moonlight from the window. She heard him lie down on his makeshift bed on the floor. Evelyn lay frozen in the massive bed, listening. She could hear the soft sound of his breathing, a steady, rhythmic presence in the dark. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. Her wedding night was over. It had been nothing like the girlish dreams she had once harbored, but it was also nothing like the brutal nightmare she had feared. She was still a stranger in a strange land, married to a man of stone, but tonight, in the darkness, she had seen a crack in the stone. He had made a choice. He had chosen a sliver of compassion over his rights. And as Evelyn finally slid under the covers, alone in her marriage bed, she felt a new, bewildering emotion take root in the desolate soil of her heart. It was not love. Not yet. It was not even hope. It was a question, a fragile, tentative question in the vast, silent dark. Asterisk. Part 3. The early days of marriage. Tension and distance. Asterisk. The dawn that followed their wedding night broke pale and cold. A merciless light that exposed the dust motes dancing in the air and offered no warmth. Evelyn awoke with a start, her body stiff from a night spent in a state of hyper-vigilant stillness. The massive bed felt even larger in the morning light, an empty continent of white sheets. Across the room, the bedroll on the floor was empty, the blanket folded with a neat, military precision. Jebediah was already gone. She dressed quickly, her hands still trembling slightly, and made her way downstairs. The house was silent save for the ever-present wind whistling in the eaves. In the main room, the fire had been rekindled, a low, steady blaze that pushed back the chill. A pot of coffee was warming on the hearth, its bitter aroma filling the air. It was a gesture, she realized, not of intimacy, but of acknowledgement, a provision. He had left her coffee. That first day, and the days that followed, fell into a pattern of strained, silent coexistence. Jebediah would rise before the sun, his movements quiet but purposeful, and be gone by the time she came downstairs. He would work the ranch with his foreman, Eli, and a handful of other hands, a remote figure she would sometimes glimpse from the window, moving with tireless energy across the vast landscape. He would return at midday for a meal she had prepared, eating quickly and silently before leaving again. Supper was a repeat of the same tense ritual. In the evenings, he would sit in his large armchair by the fire, cleaning his rifle or making entries in a large leather-bound ledger. Evelyn would sit at the far end of the long dining table, mending one of his shirts or trying to read a book she'd brought from home, though the words often blurred before her eyes. The silence between them was a living thing, a third presence in the room, thick with unspoken questions and unresolved fears. And every night, the ritual was the same. He would retreat to his bedroll on the floor of their shared room, granting her the bed, a silent guardian maintaining a chasm of distance that was both a relief and a source of profound loneliness. He treated her not with cruelty, but with an absolute, unbreachable reserve. She was a fixture in his house, a part of the arrangement, but she was not his wife in any way that truly mattered. The house itself became her world, and her adversary. It was a man's house, built for utility, and it resisted her attempts to soften it. The cast-iron stove was a temperamental beast that either choked the room with smoke or refused to heat at all. Cooking, which had been a simple chore in her mother's well-appointed kitchen, became a daily battle of wits against limited supplies. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, potatoes, and onions were the staples. To create a palatable meal from such meager ingredients required an ingenuity she did not yet possess. Her first loaf of bread was as hard as a river stone. Her first stew was a watery, flavorless concoction. Jebediah ate them both without a word of complaint, his stoicism a more damning critique than any harsh word could have been. After a week of this isolating routine, Jebediah announced at breakfast, "We are going to town for supplies." The thought of facing the people of Cedar Creek sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. I have a list," she stammered, her voice rusty from disuse. "Good," he said, and that was all. The ride into town in the buckboard was as silent as her first journey to the ranch. When they arrived, the effect of their joint appearance was immediate. Eyes followed them from the saloon, from the porch of the general store. Whispers trailed them like burrs on a blanket. Asterisk. There's Claymore and his little bride. Looks more like his daughter. 18, they say. Bought and paid for. Asterisk. Evelyn kept her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the heat of the stares, the weight of the judgment. They saw her as a fool or a fortune hunter, a fragile eastern flower destined to wither and die in the harsh Wyoming sun. Their first stop was the church, to deliver a small tithe from the ranch. Reverend Blackwood met them at the door, his tall, thin frame clad in severe black. He was a man whose piety seemed to curdle into a permanent state of disapproval. "Mr. Claymore, Mrs. Claymore," he said, the title sounding like an accusation on his lips. His eyes, small and sharp, flickered over Evelyn. "It is good to see you observing your duties as a married couple. A proper union, sanctified by law, is a pillar of our community. It must be nurtured with faith and commitment." The implication was clear. He viewed their marriage as a transaction, a convenient arrangement that skirted the edges of moral propriety. The age gap, Jebediah's reclusive nature, her sudden appearance from 1,000 miles away, it all smelled of something unseemly to him. Jebediah merely nodded, his face an unreadable mask. "Reverend." He handed over the pouch of coins and turned to leave, his dismissal of the preacher's veiled insinuations absolute. Inside the general store, a cluttered cavern smelling of sawdust, coffee beans, and cured leather. Evelyn felt the scrutiny intensify, while Jebediah spoke to the proprietor about an order of barbed wire. She stood near the bolts of calico fabric, pretending an interest she didn't feel. "Don't let them get to you, girl." The voice was low and clear, with a surprising lack of guile. Evelyn turned to see a woman standing beside her. She was perhaps in her late 40s, with a face browned and lined by the sun, but her eyes were a startlingly clear blue. She was tall and sturdy, dressed not in a restrictive dress, but in a practical split skirt and a man's flannel shirt, her gray-streaked hair tied back in a simple, functional knot. "I beg your pardon," Evelyn said. "The gossips," the woman clarified, gesturing with her chin toward a pair of women whispering by the pickle barrel. "They've got tongues sharp enough to shear a sheep. Pay them no mind. They're just jealous you landed the biggest ranch and the quietest husband in the territory." She extended a work-roughened hand. "Margaret Thornton. My spread borders Claymore's to the north." Evelyn shook her hand, surprised by the strength in her grip. "Evelyn Claymore." Margaret's eyes crinkled at the corners in a genuine smile. I know who you are. Look, child, life out here is hard. It'll chew you up and spit you out if you let it. You need to grow a thick skin and learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Your husband is a good man, but he's quiet. You'll need to find your own voice. She picked up a small bag of yeast. If your bread's coming out like a brick, it's because this air is too dry. Let the dough rise twice in a warm, damp cloth, and add a spoonful of molasses if you have it. With that, she gave Evelyn a brisk nod, paid for her goods, and was gone. The unexpected kindness, the straightforward, practical advice, was like a drink of cool water in a desert. For the first time since her arrival, someone had spoken to her not as an object of pity or scorn, but as a person. The encounter changed something in Evelyn. Margaret Thornton's words echoed in her mind on the silent ride home. Asterisk, learn to stand on your own 2 feet. She could not spend the rest of her life as a trembling mouse, a prisoner in that big, silent house. If this was her life, she would have to learn to live it. She started with the kitchen, following Margaret's advice. She tried the bread again. This time, it rose beautifully, and the loaf that came out of the oven was light and fragrant. She made a stew with smoked ham hock and beans that was rich and thick. That evening, when Jebediah took his first bite, he paused. He looked down at his bowl, then across the table at her. He didn't say a word, but his eyes held a flicker of surprise, of acknowledgement. It was a tiny victory, but it felt monumental. Her next challenge was mobility. She was trapped at the ranch, her world confined to the house and the yard. She needed to learn to ride. One afternoon, seeing a gentle-looking mare in a nearby corral, she decided to try. Using a mounting block, she managed to clumsily hoist herself into the saddle. The moment she was seated, the horse, startled by her awkwardness, sidestepped. Evelyn, completely unbalanced, tumbled to the ground in an undignified heap, the wind knocked out of her. She lay in the dust, mortified and gasping for air, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Jebediah standing there, his face grim. "What in God's name are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp with something that sounded almost like anger. I want to learn to ride," she said, her voice trembling with humiliation. He stared down at her for a long moment. She expected a lecture, a command to stay in the house where she belonged. Instead, he reached down and offered her a hand, pulling her to her feet with an effortless strength. "Not on this mare, and not like that," he said. "You'll get yourself killed." The next day, he led a different horse from the barn, a steady, older gelding named Patches. "This one will take care of you," he said. For the next hour, he taught her. He didn't coddle her. His instructions were curt, direct, and practical. Heels down. Sit straight. Look where you're going, not at the ground. He adjusted her grip on the reins, his large, calloused hands briefly covering hers. The contact was brief and professional, but it sent a jolt through her, a startling current of warmth in the cold distance between them. Riding gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt since arriving. She started taking short rides along the creek bed, the wind in her hair, the vast sky above her. She was not just Claymore's bride anymore. She was a woman on a horse, a part of the immense landscape, not just an observer of it. Her growing confidence led to a new, more daunting request. "I want you to teach me how to shoot," she said to him one evening by the fire. He stopped cleaning his rifle and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why?" "Because," she said, meeting his gaze directly, her voice stronger than she expected it to be. "Like you said, I could get myself killed out here. There are snakes and other things. I don't want to be helpless." It was the logic of the West, the logic of survival. It was a language he understood. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Tomorrow, after chores." The lesson took place behind the main barn, where he had set up some empty cans on a fence post. He handed her a small, Lightweight rifle. It felt heavy and cold in her arms. "This is a tool," he said, his voice low and serious. "You respect it. You never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot. You treat it as if it's always loaded." He stood behind her, positioning her stance, showing her how to brace the stock against her shoulder. His proximity was unsettling. She could feel the heat from his body, smell the scent of worn leather and clean sweat. He was so close she could hear the soft sound of his breathing. "Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it, slow and steady," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, steadying her. "Breathe out and squeeze." She did as he said. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the noise shockingly loud. One of the cans flew off the fence post. A thrill, sharp and clean, shot through her. She had done it. She turned to look at him, a triumphant smile on her face. He was looking at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than duty or distance in his eyes. It was a spark of respect, a glimmer of something warmer. He had seen her not as the fragile girl from the East, but as a woman learning the hard rules of his world. "Again," he said, his voice still gruff, but the edge was gone. The distance between them was still there, a vast and intimidating territory. He still slept on the floor. Their conversations were still sparse and utilitarian, but a bridge was being built, forged not of soft words and tender glances, but of shared lessons in survival, of the weight of a rifle and the feel of reins in her hands. She was no longer just the bride he had acquired. She was becoming a woman of the West, and he, the hermit of Stone Creek Ranch, was beginning to see her. **, Part 4, Love Begins to Bloom. A Light in the Desert, **. The change came as all great changes do in Wyoming carried on the wind. For days, the sky had been a hard, metallic gray, and the air held a biting, anticipatory stillness. The usual moan of the wind deepened into a guttural growl that rattled the window panes. Jebediah, who read the land and the sky as other men read books, came in from the north pasture one afternoon, his face etched with a grim urgency. "A blizzard's coming," he announced, his voice devoid of its usual placid rhythm. A bad one. The quiet, predictable routine of the ranch shattered. There was a flurry of controlled, efficient activity. Jeb and Eli worked with the ranch hands to drive the herds into the sheltered valleys, their shouts sharp and clear on the frigid air. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window as they worked against the fading light, moving with a desperate purpose. Jebediah was a force of nature in himself, a commander marshaling his troops against an invading army. He directed the men to secure the barn doors, to check the stores of hay, to bring in armload after armload of firewood until the logs were stacked halfway to the ceiling beside the great stone hearth. His focus turned to her only when every animal and every structure was secured. He came into the house, bringing a blast of icy air with him, snow already clinging to his hat and shoulders. "Have you filled the water buckets?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room, checking for drafts. "Yes, and the pantry is full." "Good." He looked at her then, a deep, searching look she hadn't seen before. It held a concern that went beyond the practical. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for any reason. This isn't an eastern squall. Evelyn, this is a killer." The storm hit just after sundown. It did not arrive, it descended, a sudden, suffocating curtain of white. The world beyond the windows vanished. The wind shrieked like a banshee, a physical assault on the house, which groaned and shuddered under the onslaught. The temperature plummeted. A fine, icy powder began to seep through the window frames, and the cold became a palpable, creeping entity. Their large, silent house, once a symbol of their isolation from each other, was transformed into a tiny, besieged outpost, a bastion against the screaming chaos of the elements. The forced proximity was absolute. There were no chores to retreat to, no distant pastures to occupy. There was only the main room, the roaring fire in the hearth, and each other. For the first day, they existed in their familiar silence, the storm an overwhelming third presence that drowned out the need for words. Jebediah was in constant motion, tending the fire, checking the door, his body a tense line of vigilance. Evelyn tried to busy herself with mending, but her hands were clumsy with cold, and her mind was consumed by the terrifying power of the blizzard. By evening, despite the blazing fire, the cold had seeped deep into the bones of the house. Evelyn, huddled in a chair with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, could not stop shivering. Jebediah, watching her from across the hearth, rose without a word. He went upstairs and returned with the heaviest wool blanket from their bed. He walked over to her and, with a surprising gentleness, unfolded it and draped it around her shoulders, tucking it in around her. His fingers brushed against her neck, a brief, calloused touch that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a curt nod and returned to his seat. A short while later, he went to the kitchen. She heard the clatter of pots and the rhythmic chop of a knife. He returned with 2 steaming bowls of soup. It was simple, made from salt pork, potatoes, and onions, but it was thick and scalding hot, and it tasted like life itself. "Eat," he commanded, his voice low but firm. "You need to keep your strength up." She ate, the warmth spreading through her limbs, chasing away the worst of the chill. He had taken care of her. It was a simple, practical act, the kind a man of the West would perform, but it felt like more. In this fortress against the storm, he was her protector, and for the first time, she felt not like his property, but like someone under his charge, someone he was determined to keep safe. The second day was worse. The snow was piled halfway up the downstairs windows, and the sound of the wind was a constant, maddening shriek. Time seemed to warp and stretch, the hours blurring together. The enforced idleness began to wear on them, and the silence that had once been a wall between them began to feel thin, fragile. It was Evelyn who broke it. "What was it like?" she asked, her voice quiet in a lull between gusts of wind. "The war." He had been staring into the fire, his face a mask of shadows and flickering light. He didn't look at her, but his body tensed. It was a subject they had never breached, a locked room in his past. She thought for a moment he would not answer. "Cold," he said finally, the word raspy and loud, the kind of loud that stays inside your head long after the guns go quiet. He paused, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "I saw things. A man shouldn't have to see. Watched boys younger than you die for a piece of muddy ground we lost the next day." He fell silent, but the room was filled with the ghosts his words had conjured. Evelyn now understood some of the hardness in his eyes, the deep-seated weariness. He was not just a quiet man. He was a man haunted. Her own story, her own fears, felt small in comparison, but his confession emboldened her. "I was so scared to come here," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "My father, he's a good man, but we had nothing. There were too many of us. When the matchmaker's letter came, it felt like a command, a duty. I cried for a week, thinking I was being sold off to a stranger in the wilderness." She finally said it aloud, the ugly, shameful fear that had been her constant companion. She expected him to be angry, insulted. Instead, he turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, his eyes holding a surprising depth of understanding. "My mother left," he said, his voice flat. "Just walked out one morning when I was 10. My father, he was a hard man before that. After she was gone, the hardness turned mean. He believed a man's will was forged with a heavy hand. His was heavy." The simple, brutal confession hung in the air between them. Evelyn's heart ached. The hermit of Stone Creek Ranch, the wealthy, powerful man the town whispered about, was once a 10-year-old boy abandoned by his mother and raised by a fist. His fortress of silence wasn't built of arrogance. It was built of scar tissue. He had walled himself off from a world that had taught him that love leaves and hands hurt. In the warmth of the fire, cocooned by the raging blizzard, they were not Jebediah Claymore, the rich cattleman, and Evelyn Grace, the mail-order bride. They were just a man and a woman, stripped bare of their titles and their secrets. Two lonely souls sharing the stories of their wounds. A heavy, emotional silence settled over them. The fire popped and crackled. The wind howled its mournful song. To break the spell, Evelyn began to hum, a soft, unconscious melody from a life she had left behind. It was a waltz her father used to play on his fiddle at town gatherings. Jebediah's head lifted. "I know that tune." "My father used to play it," she said, a sad smile touching her lips. He watched her for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, and she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before. A deep, profound longing. The blizzard raged outside, a reminder of the world's chaos. But inside this small circle of light, something new and fragile was taking shape. Slowly, as if in a dream, he stood up. He was a large, intimidating man, but his movements were hesitant, almost shy. He crossed the space between them and stopped before her chair. He didn't speak. He simply held out his hand. It was a work-worn hand, calloused and scarred, but it was offered with a vulnerability that took her breath away. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She placed her trembling hand in his, and he drew her gently to her feet. He placed one hand on the small of her back, his touch sending a shockwave of warmth through her. With his other hand, he held hers, lacing his fingers through her own. There was no music but the wild symphony of the storm and the crackling of the fire. He began to move, guiding her in a slow, shuffling circle on the rough-hewn floorboards. It was awkward at first. He was not a practiced dancer, and she was dizzy with the sudden, shocking intimacy of it. But then they found a rhythm. His steps grew more confident, and she followed his lead. They moved together in the flickering, golden light, two solitary figures finding solace in a shared, silent dance. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the most real and vital sound she had ever heard. The world outside, with its ice and wind and biting judgment, ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the fire, the solid strength of the man holding her, and the gentle, unspoken language of their dance. It was a dance of forgiveness for the past, of acceptance in the present, and of a fragile, unspoken promise for the future. When the dance finally slowed to a stop, they did not move apart. He kept his arms around her, and his hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek with a tenderness that made her want to weep. "Evelyn?" he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. The storm still raged, but inside the house, inside the walls of his heart, the blizzard had broken. That night, when it was time to sleep, he did not go to the bedroll on the floor. He took her hand and led her up the stairs, and the barrier between them, forged of fear and loneliness, finally, irrevocably, melted away in the warmth of the firelight. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 5, Conflict. The enemy appears, asterisk, asterisk. The thaw that followed the blizzard was more than just meteorological. In the weeks that passed, the icy distance between Evelyn and Jebediah melted into a quiet, tentative warmth. The house, once a fortress of solitude, began to feel like a shared home. There were small, unspoken intimacies, the way he'd watch her as she arranged wildflowers in a jar on the mantel, the way her hand would briefly rest on his shoulder as she poured his morning coffee. He still spoke few words, but his silence was no longer a wall. It was a comfortable space they shared. He had begun to teach her the names of the constellations in the vast, clear night sky, his deep voice a low murmur beside her in the darkness. The bedroll on the floor was forgotten. The ghosts of their pasts had not vanished, but they no longer ruled the house. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a polished black carriage, an ostentatious vessel of Eastern wealth that looked profoundly out of place on the dusty main street of Cedar Creek. Out of it stepped a man who was its perfect accompaniment. He was handsome in a smooth, predatory way. Dressed in a tailored wool suit that defied the grit of the West. His name, he announced to the curious onlookers at the general store, was Matthew Monroe. And he was here on a matter of urgent family business concerning a young woman named Evelyn Grace, or as she was now known, Mrs. Jebediah Claymore. Matthew did not ride out to the Stone Creek Ranch. That was not his way. His battlefield was the court of public opinion, and his weapons were insinuation and poison. Served with a charming smile, he took a room at the town's only boarding house and set to work. He spoke to the men in the saloon, buying rounds of whiskey and presenting himself as a wronged man of honor. He attended Reverend Blackwood's Sunday service, his face a mask of pious concern, and dropped a shockingly large bill into the collection plate. His story was a masterful piece of fiction, woven with just enough truth to be believable. The Grace family, he claimed, was deeply indebted to his own. An arrangement had been made long ago, a pact between gentlemen, to settle the debt. Evelyn's hand in marriage was to be the final payment. I was to be her husband, he'd say, his voice resonating with sorrowful dignity, to provide for her, to welcome her into a respectable family. But her father, in his desperation, was swayed by the promise of cold, hard cash from the West. He broke our pact. He sold his own daughter to a reclusive stranger, shipping her off like livestock to this wilderness. He would then lean in, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. I do not blame the girl entirely. She was young, easily swayed by tales of a fortune in cattle. A woman's head can be turned by such things. But it is a matter of honor. A promise was broken. A woman's virtue has been compromised. The poison seeped into the soil of Cedar Creek and found fertile ground. The whispers that had followed Evelyn on her first trip to town were now revived with a venomous new life. The story confirmed every suspicion the townspeople had harbored. It made perfect, sordid sense the pretty young bride, the wealthy, older husband, the hasty mail-order arrangement. She wasn't a pioneer. She was a harlot with a good head for business. Reverend Blackwood, his own doubts validated by this handsome, God-fearing man from the East, became Matthew's most powerful ally. His sermons, once focused on damnation in the abstract, now took on a specific, local target. He thundered from the pulpit about the canker of greed and the sacred bonds of marriage being made a mockery by worldly transactions. He did not name names, but every eye in the congregation knew who he was talking about. Evelyn felt the change immediately. A trip to town for supplies with Eli, the foreman, became an exercise in humiliation. Mrs. Miller, the justice's wife, who had been cautiously friendly, now turned her back with a deliberate snub. At the general store, the proprietor's wife served her with icy civility, her lips a thin, disapproving line. The air was thick with a judgment that was no longer veiled. It was Margaret Thornton who finally told her the truth. She found Evelyn by the creek behind the ranch, where she'd gone to escape the oppressive silence of the house. There's a man in town, Margaret began, her voice blunt and devoid of pity. Calls himself Matthew Monroe. Says he's a cousin of yours. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you were promised to him before you married Jebediah. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Matthew, he was a distant cousin, a man whose ambition and ruthlessness had always made her father profoundly uneasy. There had been complex business dealings, loans and threats she had never fully understood. The idea that she had been part of one of his schemes turned her stomach. He's a liar, Evelyn whispered, her hands clenched into fists. I know that, Margaret said, her clear blue eyes steady. And Jeb knows it. But the town, they're eating it up with a spoon. You and Jeb, you've kept to yourselves. People don't like what they don't understand. This story gives them an easy answer. That night, Evelyn told Jebediah everything. They sat before the fire, the same fire that had witnessed their first dance. But the mood was somber, the shadows in the room heavy with the encroaching threat. She explained the distant family connection, the debts, the fear she had always felt in Matthew's presence. Jebediah listened without interruption, his face carved from stone. The muscles in his jaw were tight, and a dangerous light smoldered in the depths of his eyes. When she finished, he did not question a single word. He did not ask for proof. His belief in her was absolute, a silent, unshakable bedrock. "He will not have you," Jebediah said, his voice a low, deadly growl. It was not a promise, it was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the mountains, and he will not speak your name again. The next morning, he rode for town. Evelyn watched him go, his back straight and unyielding, a solitary rider heading into a battle of words that she knew would soon turn to something worse. Fear warred with a fierce, protective pride in her heart. He was doing this for her, for them. But Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, you need to find your own voice. She could not hide behind Jebediah's strength. This was her name, her honor. That was being dragged through the mud. This was her fight, too. After a moment of agonizing indecision, she saddled Patches and rode after him. She arrived in Cedar Creek to find the main street humming with a tense, expectant energy. Jebediah's horse was tied outside the saloon. She knew he was in there, confronting Matthew. But her fight was not in the saloon. Amongst the whiskey and the spitting men, it was with the women, in the court of whispers and moral judgment. She tied Patches outside the general store and, taking a deep, fortifying breath, she walked inside. The store fell silent. A half-dozen women, including Reverend Blackwood's wife, were gathered near the counter. They stopped their conversation and turned as one to stare at her, their faces a mixture of hostility and morbid curiosity. "Mrs. Claymore, Mrs." Blackwood said, her voice dripping with sanctimonious pity. "We were just discussing the unfortunate situation. To be caught between two men, it must be terribly distressing for you." The condescension was a slap in the face. The old Evelyn would have flushed with shame and fled. But the woman who had survived a blizzard, who had learned to ride and shoot, who had been cherished by a good, quiet man, did not back down. She met the Reverend's wife's gaze directly. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried across the silent store with perfect clarity. "There is no situation, Mrs. Blackwood, and I am not caught between two men. I have one husband. His name is Jebediah Claymore." A murmur went through the group. This was not the response they had expected. "But Mr. Monroe says a promise was made," another woman chimed in. "Mr. Monroe is a man who believes the world owes him whatever he wants," Evelyn replied, her voice gaining strength. "He is interested in my husband's land and my husband's money. He is using my name and a fabricated story to try and get it." She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over all of them. "You all look at me, and you see a girl from the East who married a wealthy man. And you've decided on a story for yourselves. But you don't know the truth. You don't know the man my husband is. You see a hermit. I see a man who has known great loss and has built a life with his own two hands. You see a transaction. I see a man who has shown me more kindness and respect than I have ever known." Her voice trembled slightly, but with passion, not fear. "My marriage is not a topic for gossip over the pickle barrel. It is my life, and I will thank you all not to speak of it, or of me, again." She turned to the proprietor. "I need a bag of flour and 2 pounds of coffee beans, please." The silence was deafening. The women were stunned, their smug certainty rocked by her direct, passionate defense. They had expected tears and shame, and had been met with a strength they did not know how to counter. Just then, the door of the store swung open. Margaret Thornton walked in, a basket over her arm. She took in the scene at a glance, the shocked faces of the townswomen. Evelyn standing tall and defiant at the counter, A slow, approving smile spread across her weathered face. She walked to stand beside Evelyn. "And I'll have the same," Margaret said to the storekeeper, her voice booming in the quiet room. "It seems Mrs. Claymore and I are of a similar mind today." Her simple, public act of solidarity was a cannon shot. It broke the spell. Mrs. Blackwood, her face tight with indignation, herded her flock of gossips out of the store. Evelyn's legs suddenly felt weak. Margaret put a steadying hand on her arm. "Well done, girl," she murmured, her blue eyes shining with respect. "Well done." When Evelyn walked out of the store a few minutes later, her supplies in her arms, she saw Jebediah waiting for her, holding the reins of her horse. He had heard the door of the saloon was swinging, and Matthew Monroe was nowhere to be seen. Jebediah's face was grim, but as his eyes met hers, she saw a fierce, burning pride that warmed her more than any fire. He took the supplies from her and tied them to her saddle. He did not speak of what had happened in the saloon, or what he had just witnessed. He didn't have to. He helped her mount her horse, his hands gentle on her waist, as they rode out of Cedar Creek, side by side. The whispers and the stares still followed them, but they no longer had the power to wound. The town was still against them, and a dangerous enemy was now their sworn foe. But for the first time, they faced it all together, a united front against the storm that was yet to come. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 6. The Decision Under the Moon. Asterisk, asterisk. Matthew Monroe was not a man to be deterred by a closed door or a public rebuke. He was a creature of calculated escalation. Defeated in the court of public opinion, he turned to the weapon he trusted most, the law, twisted to serve his own ends. A few days after the confrontation in town, a rider delivered a formal-looking envelope to the ranch. It was a letter from a lawyer in Cheyenne, a verbose and threatening document that laid out Matthew's fabricated claim. It accused Jebediah Claymore of luring an impressionable young woman into a fraudulent marriage to usurp a prior binding family agreement. It spoke of damages, of moral injury, and of petitioning the territorial court to have the marriage annulled. It was, in essence, a declaration of war, not a war of fists or bullets, but one of reputation and ruin. Matthew's strategy was clear. He would drag them through a public, humiliating legal battle, soiling Evelyn's name and challenging Jebediah's standing in the territory. He knew that for a man as private as Jeb, the prospect of such a spectacle was a torment in itself. He was counting on Jebediah to break, to negotiate, to cast Evelyn aside to protect his quiet, orderly world. Jebediah read the letter twice, his face growing harder and colder with each word. He did not rage. His anger was a far more dangerous thing, a slow, freezing burn. He placed the letter on the mantelpiece, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. "He is trying to break us," Evelyn said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and fury. "He is trying to break me, Jebediah corrected, his voice a low rumble. "He thinks I will trade you for my peace. He does not know me." But the threat lingered in the air between them, a foul poison. For the next few days, a heavy tension settled over the ranch. Jebediah became even more silent. His thoughts turned inward. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching. She saw the weight of the decision he was facing. To fight Matthew in court would be to subject her to unimaginable scrutiny, to have her name and their life together dissected by strangers. To ignore him would be to live under a constant threat. The breaking point came late one afternoon. Another rider arrived, this one with a simple, verbal message. Matthew Monroe requested a meeting with Mr. Claymore, alone, at the northern edge of his property, by the old cottonwood that marked the border with the Thornton Ranch, at moonrise. It was a challenge, a classic Western parley, stripped of legal niceties and brought back to the fundamental conflict between two men. "You cannot go," Evelyn pleaded, her hands gripping his arm. "It's a trap." "It is a trap I must walk into," Jebediah said, his eyes dark and resolute. "This cannot be settled with lawyers in a dusty courtroom. This is between him and me. It ends tonight." He was a man of the West, and this was the only language he truly trusted. He checked his Colt peacemaker, the familiar, methodical clicks of the cylinder echoing in the quiet room. He put on his heavy coat and his hat, his movements deliberate. He was preparing for battle. "Stay in the house," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Lock the door behind me." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and grim resolve. Then he was gone, a tall, solitary figure melting into the twilight. Evelyn locked the door as he had ordered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She paced the length of the main room. A caged animal. The house, their sanctuary, felt like a prison. She could not simply wait, helpless, while the man she loved walked into danger. Margaret Thornton's words came back to her. "You need to stand on your own 2 feet." Her shooting lessons with Jebediah flashed in her mind. "Respect the tool. Squeeze. Don't pull." She had a choice. She could be the frightened girl from the East, or she could be the woman this land, and this man, had made her. Making a decision that was as terrifying as it was certain. She ran to the small cabinet where Jebediah kept the ammunition. She took the lightweight rifle he had taught her with, its smooth wooden stock feeling cool and solid in her hands. Her fingers, though trembling, moved with a newfound confidence as she loaded it. She pulled on her own coat and, slipping out the back door, she made for the stables. She would not ride Patches. His familiar shape would be too easily recognized. Instead, she saddled a dark, swift mare, keeping to the shadows of the barns. She did not follow him directly, but took a wide, looping path, using the rolling hills for cover. The moon was rising, a perfect, cold disk in a sky of polished obsidian, casting the snow-covered landscape in an ethereal silver and black. The world was utterly silent, the snow damping all sound save for the soft thud of her horse's hooves and the frantic beating of her own heart. She tethered her horse in a thicket of aspen a 1/4 mile from the old cottonwood and crept forward on foot, the rifle held tight in her hands. The cold air burned in her lungs. She reached the crest of a small hill that overlooked the meeting place and dropped to her stomach in the snow, her body instantly numb with cold. Below her, the scene was stark and theatrical. 2 figures on horseback sat facing each other in the center of a vast, moonlit field of snow. Even from a distance, she could recognize Jebediah's powerful, rooted posture and Matthew's arrogant, restless energy. A third man, one of Matthew's hired cronies, waited a short distance away. The wind carried their voices to her in broken, indistinct fragments. She could not make out the words, but she could read the body language. Matthew was gesturing, his movements expansive and mocking. Jebediah sat as still as a statue, a study in contained force. This was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. The tension stretched, becoming a thin, humming wire. Then, Matthew laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the frozen air. He made a move she couldn't quite see, and then his hand came up, a glint of moonlight on blued steel. He was holding a pistol. He wasn't pointing it at Jebediah, but holding it out, a clear and final threat. The pretense was over. This was about power, raw and simple. Time slowed down. Evelyn's mind went perfectly clear. All the fear, all the doubt, fell away, replaced by a cold, sharp certainty. She was not going to let this man destroy the life she and Jebediah had built. She was not a prize to be fought over. She was a partner. She raised the rifle, bracing the stock against her shoulder just as Jebediah had taught her. The metal was icy against her cheek. She lined up the sights, not on Matthew, but on the thick, snow-laden branch of the cottonwood tree directly above his head. She remembered Jeb's voice, a calm murmur in her memory, breathe out and squeeze. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack in the pristine silence. The bullet struck the branch with a sharp thwack, and a heavy load of snow cascaded down, dumping directly onto Matthew's head and shoulders. His horse shied violently, and the pistol flew from his startled grasp, landing harmlessly in a snowdrift. For a heartbeat, all three men were frozen in shock. Matthew, sputtering and covered in snow, looked wildly around. Jebediah's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills, a look of disbelief on his face. Evelyn had already ejected the spent cartridge and chambered a new round. She stood up. In the stark moonlight, she was a small, determined figure against the snow, the rifle held ready. She was too far away for them to see her expression, but her stance spoke with an eloquence that needed no words. It was a declaration of allegiance, a statement of intent. Matthew stared at her, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, not by the formidable Jebediah Claymore, but by the timid little mail-order bride he had dismissed as a pawn. His public humiliation was complete. He spat a curse, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away into the darkness, his hired man scrambling to follow. Jebediah did not move. He watched them go. Then, slowly, he turned his horse and looked up at the hill where Evelyn stood. He dismounted and began walking toward her, his long strides eating up the distance. Her courage faltered. The adrenaline faded, leaving her trembling in the bitter cold. What had she done? She had disobeyed him. She had interfered. She watched him approach, his face unreadable in the moonlight, her heart caught between hope and fear. He stopped a few feet from her, his tall frame casting a long shadow on the snow. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then at her face, pale and resolute in the moonlight. The silence stretched between them, filled with the enormity of what had just happened. She expected anger, a sharp reprimand. Instead, his face broke, the stony mask crumbled, and she saw a raw, powerful emotion that stunned her. It was relief, so profound it was almost pain. It was wonder. It was love. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, burying his face in her hair. She could feel the violent tremor that ran through his body. "I thought I'd lost you," he rasped, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her frozen cheeks. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. "When I saw him draw that pistol," he said, his voice low and shaking, "the only thing I could think was that my life meant nothing without you in it. This land, this ranch. It was all just a place to be alone, until you came." Tears welled in her eyes, freezing on her lashes. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "That first night," he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "The night of our wedding. I made a bargain for a wife, but when I saw you cry, I saw a girl who was terrified and alone, and I knew I couldn't be the man who caused her more pain." He looked deep into her eyes, the moonlight reflecting in their dark depths. "I've been a fool, Evelyn. I've been letting us live by the terms of that old bargain, but that's not what this is. Not anymore." He released her face and took her hand, the one not holding the rifle. In both of his, he held it to his chest, and she could feel the powerful, steady beat of his heart. "From that first night, when you cried, I knew you were more than just a bride. You were the one I wanted to choose. I'm choosing you now. Evelyn, not as part of a contract, but for all my days, will you be my wife, my true wife?" The tears she had held back finally fell, hot against her cold skin. It was the proposal she had never dared to dream of, offered not in a parlor with flowers, but in a frozen field under the moon, with the scent of gunpowder still faint on the air. It was a proposal forged in conflict and sealed by a shared act of courage. "Yes," she whispered, the word a plume of white in the frigid air. "Oh, Jeb, yes." He swept her into his arms again, and this time his kiss was not one of desperation, but of profound, boundless joy. It was a promise made and a promise accepted, under the silent, watchful moon, in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West. They were no longer two strangers bound by law, but a husband and a wife, bound by a love that had proven strong enough to face down the darkness. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 7. Aftermath and Healing. A community transformed asterisk, asterisk. The ride back to the ranch was a world away from all the silent, tense journeys that had come before it. They rode side by side, their horses walking at a slow, easy pace, their legs occasionally brushing against each other. The moon, their sole witness, bathed the snow-covered plains in a light that felt less like cold silver and more like a gentle, cleansing benediction. Jebediah did not release Evelyn's hand for the entire journey, his strong, warm grip a constant, grounding reassurance. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of uncertainty, but a shared space of profound, unwordable emotion. Everything had changed. News, like water, finds a way to travel even in the most sparsely populated lands. Matthew Monroe vanished from Cedar Creek before the sun was fully up, his fine carriage kicking up a cloud of dust that was the only testament to his ever having been there. But the hired man who had been with him, a drifter named Carl, was less discreet. In a saloon a day's ride west, fueled by cheap whiskey and a need to be the center of attention, he told a story. It was a garbled, self-aggrandizing version of events, but the core elements were unmistakable: a moonlit meeting, a challenge, and the shocking appearance of Claymore's young wife with a rifle, who had single-handedly sent the fancy man from the east running with his tail between his legs. The story trickled back to Cedar Creek, and like a game of whispers, it was transformed. It became a legend. In this new telling, Evelyn was not a victim or a pawn. She was a heroine, a woman of grit and spirit, a true Western woman who had defended her home and her husband. Her defiant stand in the general store was now recalled not as an act of impertinence, but as the first sign of a fierce and loyal heart. The town, which had been so quick to judge and condemn, was now forced into a collective, uncomfortable reassessment. They had misjudged her. They had misjudged them both. The first and most powerful voice in this changing tide was Margaret Thornton's. She heard the drifter's tale and recognized the steel of truth within the embellished narrative. She made it her personal mission to set the record straight. She spoke to the other ranch wives, the practical, hard-working women whose opinions formed the true backbone of the community. "We were wrong," she said, her voice blunt and unequivocal as she spoke to two of them outside the general store. "We saw a pretty face and an old name, and we listened to the whispers of a snake. What we should have seen was a girl trying to make a life in a hard land. She didn't just survive, she fought. She stood up to us in this very store, and then she stood up for her husband when it counted. That's not the mark of a harlot. That's the mark of a neighbor worth having." Her words carried weight. The women, who valued strength and resilience above all else, began to nod in agreement. The narrative shifted. Evelyn and Jebediah were no longer the town's shameful secret. They were its most compelling drama, a story of unexpected love and courage. The most immediate casualty of this new reality was the authority of Reverend Blackwood. His sermons about the canker of greed now rang hollow, his piety exposed as a thin veneer for poor judgment and a love of sanctimonious gossip. He had aligned himself with a liar and a coward against a couple who had proven their mettle. The pews at his Sunday service began to look a little emptier. The deference he had once commanded was replaced by a cool, polite distance. Within 2 months, the bishop reassigned him to a dusty, remote parish on the far edge of the territory, a quiet and ignominious exile. For Evelyn and Jebediah, the consequences were more personal and profound. The walls of their isolation, both self-imposed and community-enforced, had been breached. They were no longer the hermit of Stone Creek Ranch and his mysterious child bride. They were simply the Claymores, and they were, for the first time, a part of the world around them. The change in Jebediah was the most remarkable. The experience of almost losing Evelyn had been a crucible, burning away the last of the bitter, protective layers he had built around his heart. The silence that had been his armor for so long began to fall away. He started to speak, not just in clipped, functional sentences, but in longer, more thoughtful ones. He would tell her about the ranch, explaining the intricate dance of seasons and cattle, not as a boss to a subordinate, but as a partner sharing the details of their life's work. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he turned to her. "Tell me about your father," he said. The question, so simple and direct, was a revelation. He had never asked about her past, about the life she had left behind. She told him, speaking of her father's kindness, his quiet struggles, her sister's dreams. He listened, his dark eyes fixed on her face, with an attentiveness that made her feel as though her small, simple story was the most important thing in the world. He even began to smile. It was a rare thing at first, a slight upward turn of his lips when she said something that amused him. But one day, when a clumsy new calf stumbled over its own feet, he let out a laugh. It was a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very center of his being, a sound of pure, unadorned joy. Evelyn stared at him, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. She had never known how much she needed to hear him laugh until that moment. Her own transformation was quieter, but no less profound. The fear that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a deep, calm confidence. She was no longer the girl who had cried on her wedding night, terrified and alone. She was the mistress of Stone Creek Ranch, a woman who knew her own mind and her own strength. She managed the large house with a deft and capable hand, oversaw a thriving vegetable garden she had planted herself, and rode across the vast plains with a freedom and skill that was a source of constant, quiet joy. The community, tentatively at first, began to reach out. An invitation arrived for a barn raising at a neighboring ranch. The old Jebediah would have ignored it. The new Jebediah, after a glance at Evelyn, wrote back to accept. Their arrival at the gathering caused a momentary hush, but then Margaret Thornton strode forward, her face wreathed in a genuine smile, and enveloped Evelyn in a hug. "It's about time you two came to a party," she boomed. The ice was broken. The men, who had always respected Claymore's skill as a rancher but had been intimidated by his silence, now approached him to talk about cattle prices and the prospects for rain. They found not a hermit, but a thoughtful, knowledgeable man who was willing to share his opinions. The women, following Margaret's lead, drew Evelyn into their circle. They did not speak of the past, of Matthew Monroe or the ugly rumors. They spoke of recipes and children and the challenges of making a home in this wild land. They treated her not as a curiosity, but as one of their own. For the first time, Evelyn felt the comforting embrace of a community, the strength that came from shared experience and mutual support. She and Jebediah were no longer an isolated island. They were the center of a world that was slowly, but surely, reorienting itself around them. The house on Stone Creek, once a cold and lonely fortress, was now filled with warmth and life. The windows were open to let in the sweet, sage-scented air. Her laughter echoed in the halls. His deep voice, no longer a rarity, was a constant, comforting presence. One afternoon, Jebediah came home to find her sitting at the big dining table, a pen in her hand, a letter half written on the table before her. "What's that?" he asked, coming to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "A letter to my father," she said, leaning her head back against his chest. I'm telling him he was right. He said I would be safe here, but I wanted to tell him that I'm more than safe. I'm happy." He bent down and kissed the top of her head, his touch gentle and sure. "Good," he murmured into her hair. That's good. The scars of their pasts had not vanished. The memory of his father's cruelty and his mother's abandonment, of her own fear and the shame of the bargain, would always be a part of their story. But they were no longer open wounds. They were healed-over places, reminders not of the pain they had endured, but of the strength they had found in each other. He, the man who had closed his heart to the world, had learned to love and trust again. And she, the girl who had been sent away to survive, had found a place where she could truly, finally, live. Asterisk, asterisk, part 10, and the promise at sunrise, asterisk, asterisk. Spring came to the high plains not as a gentle awakening, but as a fierce and sudden assertion of life. The last of the deep snows melted away in a rush, feeding the creeks until they ran high and boisterous. The vast, sleeping brown of the prairie was suddenly, almost violently, green. Carpets of Indian paintbrush and wild lupine erupted in defiant splashes of color, and the air, once thin and sharp with cold, grew soft and carried the sweet, earthy scent of damp soil and new growth. The transformation of the land was a mirror to the life that had taken root inside the stone house of the Stone Creek Ranch. The quiet, orderly existence of two strangers had blossomed into the rich, intricate, and sometimes messy life of a husband and wife who were deeply in love. The house was filled with the small sounds of a shared life, the murmur of their voices late into the night, the sound of Evelyn humming as she kneaded bread in the kitchen, the solid, reassuring thud of Jebediah's boots on the porch at the end of a long day. He had taught her the rhythms of the land, and she, in turn, had taught him the rhythms of the heart. She learned to read the clouds for signs of rain and to tell the health of a calf by the look in its eyes. He learned the particular way her smile tilted when she was teasing him, and to recognize the sound of her footsteps, a lighter, quicker counterpoint to his own heavy tread. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress to keep the world out. She had simply walked inside and turned it into a home. They rose before dawn, as was their habit, moving in the comfortable, synchronized dance of a long-established couple. There was a particular beauty to this time of day, a sacred quiet before the world awoke. He would build the fire while she made the coffee, their hands occasionally brushing, their movements weaving around each other in the soft light of the lantern. This morning, however, was different. As the first pale, gray light began to outline the eastern horizon, Jebediah turned to her, a rare, spontaneous impulse in his eyes. "Leave the chores," he said. "Ride with me." She didn't need to ask where. She simply smiled and nodded, a thrill of quiet joy singing in her veins. She pulled on her sturdy riding skirt and boots, and he met her at the stables, their two best horses already saddled and waiting. They rode out from the ranch, not with the driving purpose of a workday, but with the easy, wandering pace of two people who had nowhere else in the world to be. They climbed the familiar ridge that overlooked their valley, the same path they had taken so many times, but this morning it felt new. The world below was waking up. A thin ribbon of mist clung to the creek bed, and the air was so clear and still they could hear the distant, contented lowing of the cattle in the north pasture. They were looking out at more than just land and livestock. They were looking at the physical manifestation of their life together, a life forged in silence and fear, and reborn in courage and love. They dismounted at the crest, tethering their horses to a lone, wind-sculpted juniper tree. They stood side by side, watching as the sun began its ascent. The sky bled from gray to pearl, then to a soft, blushing pink. The first ray of direct sunlight broke over the distant mountains, a brilliant, blinding sliver of gold that sent long, searching fingers of light across the plains, setting the dew on the new grass sparkling like a field of scattered diamonds. Evelyn leaned against Jebediah's side, and his arm came around her, pulling her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of leather, wood smoke, and the clean, sage-scented air that always clung to him. This was peace, a deep, profound peace that settled not just in her mind, but in her very bones. She thought back to her arrival, to the terrified, lonely girl who had stepped off the stagecoach into this same vast, intimidating landscape. The land had not changed. It was still wild, still subject to brutal storms and unforgiving droughts. The wind still had its mournful, lonely voice. But she had changed. She no longer saw an empty, hostile wilderness. She saw home. She saw the creek where she had caught her first fish, the pasture where she had learned to ride, the distant hills she had explored with a growing sense of freedom and belonging. She saw the roof of the house where the man she loved had danced with her in the firelight and had chosen compassion over his rights. Jebediah, too, was lost in the spectacle of the dawn, but his thoughts were on the woman beside him. He looked down at the top of her head, at the way the new light caught the strands of her hair, turning them to spun gold. Before her, this sunrise had just been a signal to begin another day of hard, solitary work. Now, it was a thing of beauty, a daily miracle to be shared. He remembered the empty, echoing silence of his house, a silence he had once mistaken for peace. He had not known he was a prisoner until she had arrived and, with her quiet courage, had handed him the key. She had not just filled the silence, she had filled a void in his soul he hadn't even known was there. The sun was fully clear of the horizon now, a magnificent, burning orb that flooded the world with clean, new light. The last of the mist in the valley below burned away, revealing the neat, orderly shapes of their ranch, a testament to their shared work and their enduring love. Evelyn shifted, turning to face him. She reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its strong, steady beat beneath her palm, a rhythm that had become the grounding metronome of her life. She looked up into his dark, loving eyes, and the journey of her entire life in this new land seemed to coalesce into a single, perfect moment of clarity. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, clear whisper, carrying all the weight and wonder of their shared past and their promised future. "At 18, I cried on my wedding night," she began, her words a gentle echo of the fear that had once defined her. "But now, at sunrise, I know I was chosen, and I choose you forever." A powerful emotion washed over Jebediah's face, a wave of love so intense it momentarily stole his breath. The memory of that night of her silent, terrified tears on the stark white bedsheet was forever seared into his memory. It was the moment his life had fractured, breaking from the hard, lonely path he had set for himself. Her courage on the moonlit field had saved their lives, but her tears on their wedding night had saved his soul. He did not answer with words. Words were still, at times, inadequate tools for the depths of what he felt. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, a fierce, protective embrace that was both a shield against the world and a sacred promise. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on the top of her head. He closed his eyes, holding this perfect, precious moment against the vast, beautiful backdrop of their home. Their promise was sealed. It was not a promise of an easy life, for the West was never easy. There would be other storms, other hardships, other struggles, but they would face them together. Their love was not a fragile, hothouse flower. It was a deep-rooted, resilient thing, like the prairie grass itself, made stronger by the harsh winds and the challenges it had endured. It was a love that was not merely arranged by circumstance, but chosen, fought for, and won. And here, in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, under the hopeful, cleansing light of a new day, it was the one thing that was strong enough to last forever. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts with you. Remember to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like the video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by more people.